En Colbún transformamos la fuerza del agua, del sol y del viento en energía para todos. Impulsamos un desarrollo consciente, mitigando el impacto en el medio ambiente. También impulsamos pequeños y grandes cambios, innovando y creciendo junto a nuestros clientes, trabajadores, proveedores y comunidades. Soñamos con promover desde Chile una transición energética responsable, impulsando las energías renovables, para que todo lo que transformemos, impulsemos y soñemos sea en equilibrio con el planeta. Colbún transforma, impulsa, sueña.
Muy buenos días a todas y todos. Soy Francisca Silva, subgerente de comunicaciones de Colbún. Hoy les doy la más cordial bienvenida a la 8ª versión de nuestro seminario Voces con Energía. Bajo el título Transición Energética Responsable, una encrucijada ineludible, hoy exploraremos uno de los temas más cruciales y urgentes de nuestro tiempo, el futuro de la transición energética. Nuestra industria está viviendo relevantes cambios y desafíos. La manera en que generamos, transportamos y consumimos energía está en el centro de estos procesos. En el camino hacia un mundo más sostenible, una transición energética responsable es prioridad. Con el fin de ahondar en estas materias, hoy contamos con la participación de Michael Liebreich, destacado referente en energías limpias, movilidad, tecnología, cambio climático, sostenibilidad y finanzas. Además, muy conocido como fundador y colaborador principal de Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Posterior a su intervención, se desarrollará una conversación entre Michael y la reconocida periodista Angélica Bulnes. Para comenzar el encuentro de hoy, y porque para nosotros en Colbún la seguridad es prioritaria, les daremos algunas recomendaciones mínimas a seguir en caso de que ocurra una emergencia. En primer lugar, mantener la calma, seguir las instrucciones del personal encargado y no actuar por iniciativa propia. Y en caso de evacuación, respetar las señales, dirigirse a las salidas de emergencia indicadas y no utilizar los ascensores. Tal como lo expresa nuestro propósito corporativo, en Colbún buscamos actuar en equilibrio con el planeta. Es por eso que este evento será carbono neutral. Para esto, les pido que por favor puedan escanear el código QR, que ya está en pantalla, y contestar algunas preguntas respecto a su traslado a este lugar hoy. Sin mayor introducción, invitamos ahora al escenario a José Ignacio Escobar, CEO de Colbún, quien se referirá a la visión que tenemos en Colbún respecto a los avances, riesgos y desafíos de la transición energética. Adelante, José Ignacio.
Ya, está el aparato listo. Buenos días, ¿cómo están todas, todos? ¿Todos bien? Bueno, estimadas, estimados asistentes, autoridades, directoras, directores, veo aquí a muchos amigos, gremios de las universidades, colegas, así que estamos muy contentos de contarles un poquito cómo estamos viendo que avanza la transición energética y sobre todo escuchar las palabras de Michael, que nos va a ilustrar e iluminar sobre qué desafío está viendo no solamente Chile, sino que el mundo, y cómo nosotros tenemos una enorme, gigantesca oportunidad para poder seguir desarrollándonos como país, como sociedad, de forma sostenible y sobre todo responsable, que es un poco el título, ¿cierto?, que hemos tratado de impulsar estos años, ¿cierto?, de ver las cosas de forma responsable, con altura de mira, con una mirada a largo plazo. Así que vamos un poquito a hablar de eso, las estrellas Michael, pero yo simplemente voy a contextualizar un poquito, a tratar de dar algunos datos, algunas ideas de dónde estamos y levantar un poquito la cabeza a la contingencia. Han sido meses complejos, pero creo que siempre es bueno tomarnos un momento, una mañanita, para reflexionar sobre, miremos el futuro, veamos el Chile del 2030, veamos el Chile hacia adelante y no nos quedemos solamente en lo que nos está pasando hoy en día. ¿Por qué destaco esto? Porque la verdad es que estos encuentros son para eso, son para encontrarnos, donde la empresa privada, la academia, las autoridades y las personas interesadas en este sector que tanto queremos con tanto cariño y que hemos ido desarrollando estos últimos 20 años, poder dialogar, poder realmente encontrar puntos de encuentro. Así que esta mañana nos salimos un poco de la contingencia energética que estamos viviendo y levantamos cabeza para mirar con optimismo, pero con realismo, el camino lleno de oportunidades que tenemos delante como país. En Colbún estamos convencidos que dentro de las muchas metas que nos hemos impuesto como sociedad, la de ser carbono neutrales al 2050 nos exige un tremendo compromiso y esfuerzo, donde tenemos que caminar de verdad todos juntos, tenemos que encontrar esos mínimos comunes, con la vista hacia el futuro, avanzando con políticas públicas y marcos regulatorios estables, con mirada a largo plazo y que se implementen de manera realista y responsable. Como les dije, este año tenemos un invitado de lujo, Michael Liebreich, fundador de Bloomberg New Energy Finance. De hecho, yo lo conocí cuando todavía era New Energy Finance, antes de Bloomberg, por ahí por el 2007-2008. Ha sido para mí un mentor, desde esa época lo sigo, creador de la famosa Hydrogen Ladder, que les invito a todos a que investiguen un poquito de ella, y que esperamos tener una grata conversación. Para mí, tener a Michael acá es como, no sé, estar conversando con la Francisca Crobeto, con Yasmani Acosta, a mi lado, ídolos, por la profunda admiración que te tengo y que conozco, como decía, el año 2008, pero sobre todo por la persona, una persona sencilla, apasionada y además deportista. Además, después de la presentación, Michael va a compartir este estrado con la gran periodista de T13 Radio, Angélica Bulnes, que nos conoce bien, nos ha acompañado en nuestros parques eólicos en el norte, para un poco profundizar estos temas sobre la transición energética responsable. Así que bueno, para comenzar, un pequeño video para invitar a reflexionar y estimular la mente. ¿Corre video? ¿No corre video? Corre video. Esto es real, ¿ah? La parte de las baterías es creación nuestra, pero la búsqueda de ChatGPT y de Google es real, ¿eh? Pónganlo nomás, para que vean el nivel de invitados que tenemos hoy en día. ¿Y por qué pongo esto? Y no es trivial, porque tenemos que mirar los desafíos globales y cómo Chile puede contribuir en esos desafíos globales, cómo esto de la transición energética es una oportunidad gigantesca que tiene Chile por delante y que tenemos que saber cómo canalizarla, ¿cierto?, para el bien de todos nosotros. Y para ello, 4 grandes desafíos que quiero profundizar. Visión de futuro, condiciones habilitantes, responsabilidad y compromiso. Y vamos a ir avanzando con cada una de ellas. Primero, visión de futuro, la demanda energética. Y me quiero detener en estos 3 elementos de los cuales se conversa mucho. Muchos titulares, muchos reportajes, mucho YouTube. Inteligencia artificial o data center, ¿cierto? Todo lo que es el mundo de los datos, la electromovilidad, que muchos de ustedes me imagino que ya la están viviendo. Yo llegué aquí en mi autito eléctrico que está enchufado ahí en el -3. Y el hidrógeno verde. ¿Pero qué significa esto para nosotros, para el país? La demanda global de energía está constantemente en aumento, particularmente la energía eléctrica. Y aquí no nos equivoquemos, no nos equivoquemos. Todo, absolutamente todo lo que se pueda electrificar debe ser y será electrificado, ya que no hay forma más eficiente y sostenible de producir movimiento, de producir calor o de producir frío y otras cosas más. Y hoy estamos en los albores de lo que será un cambio discreto en la velocidad de crecimiento de dicha demanda, impulsada en gran parte por el avance de la inteligencia artificial, de las criptomonedas, de los data centers, del mundo digital. La irrupción de la electromovilidad y la llegada del hidrógeno verde, entre otras tendencias tecnológicas, cada día más competitivas, de escala global y con un enorme, pero enorme consumo de electricidad que ya detallamos más adelante. El desafío gigantesco nos va a transformar energéticamente como país y como sociedad, dadas las tremendas ventajas y recursos naturales que nos ha dado nuestra tierra, la diversidad de nuestra geografía, pero por sobre todo el talento de nuestra gente. Perdón, me adelanté. Estamos todavía en IA. Ahí estamos. Solamente respecto a este punto, inteligencia artificial. Chile tiene una capacidad instalada de 36,7 gigas, gracias a la realidad. Para ser exacto, voy a decir roughly 37.000 megas, pero ya, 36,7 gigas. Y consumimos anualmente alrededor de 83 terawatt-horas de energía al año. Exacto, y lo puse en 80 para redondear. 35 gigas o 36 gigas, 80 teras de energía. Con una demanda media en potencia de en torno a los 7.000 megas y un pic de demanda de 10.000. 35.000 de capacidad instalada, 7.000 de demanda media, 10.000 de demanda máxima. Acuérdense. En temas de IA, la Agencia Internacional de la Energía estima que la demanda mundial de electricidad proveniente del procesamiento de datos, criptomonedas, inteligencia artificial, aumentará como mínimo, línea base, 800 terawatt-horas, 10 veces Chile al 2026, o sea, a la vuelta de la esquina. 10 veces Chile solamente para bits y bytes. Un incremento del 75% respecto a los 460 terawatt-horas que se consumieron el año pasado. 10 Chiles en procesamiento de datos. Solamente en la industria eléctrica americana, en Estados Unidos, se estima que los nuevos data centers que se van a necesitar para respaldar el crecimiento de estas tecnologías en los próximos 5 años va a consumir la energía equivalente a agregar 40 millones de hogares en Estados Unidos en los próximos 5 años. ¿Cuántos hogares hay en Estados Unidos hoy en día? 130 millones de hogares. O sea, es subir casi un 40% la demanda eléctrica en Estados Unidos por efecto de los data centers. Y este crecimiento en realidad está limitado. ¿Y por qué está limitado? Por el acceso a energía, 24/7, idealmente sostenible y suficiente. De hecho, muchos data centers hoy en día en Estados Unidos están reabriendo plantas nucleares para instalarse right beside. Este crecimiento no solo se debe al consumo de las grandes tecnológicas, ¿cierto? Los Amazon, los Google, los Meta, etc., sino que también aplicaciones de consumo masivo. Asistentes virtuales, recomendaciones personalizadas, ChatGPT, análisis en tiempo real, you name it. Todo lo que ustedes hacen consume y consume y consume electricidad. Tan importante es este requerimiento energético que Microsoft o Amazon, como les dije, están de alguna forma reimpulsando la energía nuclear en Estados Unidos para poder abastecerse de energía suficiente. ¿Y qué tiene que estar con Chile? Bueno, pues todo. Ya que transportar bytes por el mundo es una forma muy rápida y eficiente de transportar electrones de kilowatts a kilobytes. ¿Se imaginan toda esa energía solar desperdiciada en nuestro desierto de Atacama, procesando los nuevos modelos climatológicos mundiales, minando bitcoins o haciendo una biografía del mejor speaker de energía del mundo, como recién lo vimos? Todo que sea made in Chile. Siguiente punto. Electromovilidad. Otra oportunidad clave en la transición energética es la electromovilidad. Según la Agencia Internacional de la Energía, nuevamente, para el 2035, la demanda de electricidad proveniente de vehículos eléctricos alcanzará, solamente con las actuales políticas públicas establecidas, los 2.200 terawatts. Recuerden, Chile, 80 terawatts, 2.200 en electromovilidad. Para ponerlo en perspectiva, el año 2023, la flota mundial de vehículos eléctricos consumió alrededor de 130 terawatts, en todo el mundo obviamente, lo cual representa aproximadamente el 0,5% de la demanda total de electricidad global, 0,5%. Esta proporción, al año 2035, en un par de años más, va a ser entre el 6 y 8% de toda la demanda eléctrica mundial, los 2.200 terawatts. Y Chile ya es líder, ya es una realidad. Por ejemplo, Chile es el número 1 del mundo en cantidad de buses urbanos eléctricos. Si lo ponemos per cápita aún más, solamente nos gana en términos absolutos China. En términos ciertos de per cápita, somos los número 1. Hidrógeno verde. Indispensable para suministrar el reemplazo de los combustibles fósiles. Todo lo que no se pueda electrificar de forma eficiente y que requiera, por sus particularidades, algún combustible, va a ser con hidrógeno, tiene que ser con hidrógeno. Y nuestro invitado ha trabajado por casi 20 años en entender el rol que va a jugar este combustible en la transición. Para el 2050, la demanda global que abarca esta industria, el transporte, la generación eléctrica, calefacción, en fin, podría alcanzar, y todavía acá hay mucha dispersión en los escenarios, entre 150, que es lo que vamos a ver con Michael, o incluso hasta 600 millones de toneladas anuales de hidrógeno verde, que es una brutalidad, dependiendo, ¿cierto?, de cuál escenario de política pública o de quién está haciendo los números. Pero de todas formas, 150, 600 es tremendo. Sea cual sea esta cifra, son oportunidades enormes donde Chile tenemos mucho que aportar. en inversiones, llegar hasta a este volumen de producción, y aquí yo creo que está equivocado el número, yo creo que son 9 trillions de inversión. Faltan 3 ceros. Lo hace son 9 millones, pero en Estados Unidos se dice 9 trillones en realidad para Chile. 9.000 billones o 9 trillones de inversiones acumulativas hasta el 2050 para cumplir con esas metas. Y en Chile estamos viendo los albores también de la industria de hidrógeno verde. Esta infraestructura incluye estaciones de producción, Haber-Bosch, ¿cierto?, para hacer amoníaco, redes de distribución, estaciones de recarga, en fin, básicamente una industria que tiene que crecer y desarrollarse desde cero. Y aquí un punto, yo sé que muchos han leído la entrevista de don Michael el fin de semana. Quiero que sean claros, Michael es uno de los principales impulsores del mundo del hidrógeno verde, de la transición energética. Pero es una mirada realista, es una mirada crítica, es una mirada científica y tecnológica. Y no todo se puede hacer con hidrógeno. No todo hace sentido técnico hacerlo con hidrógeno. Y por eso está la Liebreich Ladder. Pero solamente si pudiéramos resolver las primeras 2 etapas, ¿cierto? La punta de la pirámide y la segunda capa, la oportunidad para Chile es gigantesca. Los invito a que se metan a las carreras Liebreich. Investiguemos bien dónde realmente el uso del hidrógeno verde hace sentido económico, hace sentido técnico, por supuesto que hace sentido medioambiental. Entonces, no nos espantemos de escuchar realismo, de escuchar data, de escuchar números duros respecto al hidrógeno y la experiencia de 20 años de Michael en el mundo entero, promoviendo y desarrollando de forma responsable el hidrógeno. Y no solamente quedarnos con los grandes titulares, que todos los días vemos en la prensa, sino que realmente quedar con un análisis profundo para ver cómo Chile puede ser un jugador mundial en esta materia. Seguimos avanzando. Esto nos lleva, ¿cierto?, al famoso trilema energético. Y aquí es donde entramos al tema de la responsabilidad. ¿Cómo podemos seguir avanzando? La low hanging fruit, la fruta fácil de la transición ya la comimos. Ya se hicieron los parques eólicos más fáciles, con mejor recurso. Los mejores lugares solares, sobre todo en este caso por acceso a subestación y transmisión, ya están. Las grandes hidráulicas ya están. Bueno, ¿qué hacemos para poder llegar a seguir reemplazando, a seguir haciendo la transición de forma acelerada? Y ahí entramos al tema del trilema. Necesitamos en Chile, para nuestros consumidores, para nuestros clientes, energía que sea sobre todo competitiva, que también sea segura. Lo estamos viviendo en estos días, ¿cierto? Tenemos que tener electricidad en nuestras vidas, sobre todo en un mundo electrificado, hospitales electrificados, transporte electrificado, nuestras casas electrificadas y sostenible. ¿Cómo logramos encontrar ese equilibrio? Y ese equilibrio lo va a encontrar Chile para Chile. Nosotros tenemos que encontrar ese camino, que es el que queremos un poco conversar hoy en día. Porque estamos frente a un momento crucial en la historia de la civilización. Y como industria tenemos que responder a esta vertiginosa alza en la demanda de energía, pero hacerlo con visión de futuro. Sobre todo con responsabilidad, basados en la ingeniería, basados en la ciencia, basados en la economía y basados en la integración de la sociedad. Tenemos que saber conciliar los requerimientos de un mundo tecnologizado, energizado, con la provisión de energías limpias, menos contaminantes, pero que a la vez aseguren seguridad, sostenibilidad y competitividad del sistema. Tenemos que equilibrar la alta demanda que se nos viene con los compromisos de transición energética que nosotros mismos nos impusimos de Chile hacia el mundo. ¿Y cómo vamos en eso? Yo creo que aquí está. Y yo creo que esta lámina, que probablemente todos ustedes la conocen, pero esta lámina nos tiene en el top 10 del mundo. Si esto no es cualquier cosa. Lo que Chile ha logrado hacer en 10 años, en esta década, del 2013 en adelante, es impresionante. Miren los números por ustedes mismos. Miren las energías renovables. ¿Cuánto se han multiplicado? ¿Cómo han crecido? Por lo tanto, tenemos que estar orgullosos de lo que hemos logrado como Chile en transición energética. En un país lejos de todo, somos una isla eléctrica, sin grandes interconexiones eléctricas con el resto de la región, hemos logrado dar la cara por la región y por el mundo en materia de transición. Y para esto tenemos que seguir integrando energías renovables, pero de forma responsable, de forma sensata. Y en esta como país hemos sido reconocidos en América Latina y en el Mundial. El año pasado, 15avos a nivel global y primeros en la región en el Renewable Energy Country Attractive Index, el índice RECAI de Ernst & Young, un índice muy reconocido. De hecho, Chile llegó a estar número 3, creo, si no me equivoco, en el RECAI. El Climate Scope de Bloomberg New Energy Finance del año 2023 nos pone también el tercer lugar en el ranking de economías emergentes, después de haberlo liderado el 2022, pero seguimos ahí top 3. El año 23 también obtuvimos el máximo puntaje en el índice de competitividad global del World Economic Forum por temas de inversión en energías renovables. Y lo hemos posicionado como líderes mundiales en consumo de suficiente energía solar, con un 7,6% de acuerdo al World Data de la Universidad de Oxford el 22. O sea, por donde ustedes lo miren, esto ha sido realmente impresionante. Según el Coordinador Eléctrico, durante los primeros 6 meses del 24, las energías renovables, un poco lo que les mostré en el gráfico, que incluye lógicamente la electricidad, aportaron más del 60% del total de la generación eléctrica. Solamente con la capacidad renovable actual y la que tenemos en construcción, al año 2030 estimamos que llegaremos tranquilamente por sobre un 70% de energía renovable, y si me preguntan a mí, yo creo que vamos a estar más cerca del 80, quizás 85%. De hecho, mientras el año 2018, hace solo 5 años, la solar y la eólica eran menos del 12% de la matriz, hoy están por sobre el 32%. En nuestro caso, ya estamos en la recta final de nuestro queridísimo proyecto Horizonte, el proyecto eólico más grande de Chile. De hecho, es la central eléctrica más grande de Chile y el segundo parque más grande de Latinoamérica, que cuando entre en operación este año, bueno, a principios del próximo en realidad, va a producir el equivalente al 25% de toda la energía eólica que se genera en el país. Con mucho esfuerzo y compromiso nos hemos ido transformando también como compañía, de forma responsable, una compañía moderna, diversificada, enfocada en nuestros clientes, en las personas y en nuestro entorno, fielmente comprometidos con nuestro propósito y avanzando decididamente en nuestra agenda energética del año 2030. Hoy tenemos también una oportunidad única para continuar este liderazgo. No nos quedemos con la condescendencia de los números que ya les comenté. Tenemos que seguir siendo líderes en la adopción de energías renovables. Y no solo eso, en la atracción de inversiones relacionadas al desarrollo energético. Para esto necesitamos crear las condiciones habilitantes que nos permitan seguir avanzando con certidumbre y con sentido de realidad. Necesitamos un sistema de permisos que entregue certeza jurídica y que sea capaz de implementar la correcta evaluación de proyectos con claridad, transparencia y, por sobre todo, con criterios uniformes en todas las regiones del país que aseguren el respeto a los lineamientos de la autoridad central. Los que viven aquí en el desarrollo de proyectos me entienden lo que digo, ¿no? No está fácil desarrollar proyectos en Chile. La complejidad y las particularidades de cada región son complicadas. Aquí yo voy a seguir mostrando un poco la slide de los números que estaba hablando, por si acaso. Además, debemos abordar la variabilidad de las energías renovables mediante el fomento de soluciones avanzadas de almacenamiento de energía, garantizando un suministro confiable y constante. Esto especialmente en el centro y norte de Chile, donde no tenemos los embalses hidráulicos, pero tenemos que ser innovadores y creativos para crear embalses solares y embalses eólicos, incentivando el surgimiento de proyectos también de hidrógeno verde, desalación de agua y cualquier otra industria que demande esa energía que tenemos en el norte, como por ejemplo también los data centers que ya comenté. Necesitamos urgentemente reforzar el marco regulatorio de la distribución eléctrica y revisar nuestro diseño de mercado hacia uno moderno y que recoja de mejor forma las particularidades de todas estas nuevas tecnologías. Debemos expandir, modernizar y digitalizar las capacidades de transmisión para integrar grandes cantidades de energía renovable a la red eléctrica con foco en flexibilidad, en seguridad y gestión de demanda. Sencillamente no podemos seguir creciendo de forma lineal entre la nueva demanda y hacerla calzar con la oferta. Tenemos que ser innovadores, creativos y hacer un uso eficiente de los recursos. Como les dije, ya pasamos holgadamente el siguiente tramo, o sea, el 50% de la matriz, pero el siguiente tramo, el siguiente por ciento, va a ser el más difícil, porque se empiezan a sentir los efectos de no contar con energía de base en todas las horas y en todos los puntos de suministro del país. Por eso este marco regulatorio debe adaptarse. Y por último, tenemos que enfrentar el enorme desafío mundial, particularmente en Chile, de la escasez de agua, insumo principal para el consumo humano, para la agricultura, para la minería, para las nuevas tecnologías, como el hidrógeno verde, o los sistemas de enfriamiento de los data centers. Contamos con el potencial de solucionarlo a través de las avanzadas tecnologías de desalinización, que van a ser sin duda un aporte sustantivo para opciones de energía limpia en el tránsito hacia el fin de la generación térmica en las próximas décadas. Pero mientras no consensuemos una estrategia nacional de hidrógeno, o de agua, o de desarrollo de data centers, con un marco regulatorio adecuado, va a ser difícil avanzar en la solución. No olvidemos que cuando Chile decidió avanzar hacia las energías renovables, pasaron varias décadas y varios gobiernos, no está el ministro Llobet por aquí, está el ministro Llobet, que gobierno a gobierno había un consenso país de donde queríamos avanzar. Y pasamos de la agenda energética al camino energético. Cada gobierno le ponía un nombre, pero era un consenso país. ¿Y qué pasó con esa estrategia de energía? Se fueron alineando el resto de los ministerios. bienes nacionales, pues, poniendo a disposición, ¿cierto?, de los desarrolladores, los territorios. El sistema de evaluación ambiental, desarrollando, por ejemplo, las guías de evaluación ambiental, y se desarrolla la guía de evaluación ambiental eólica, solar, hidráulica, biomasa, todo. El coordinador eléctrico también, desarrollando estudios que permitieran ver dónde se podían insertar renovables en los distintos puntos del país. En fin, se empezó a movilizar toda la institucionalidad del país, toda la sociedad civil, las empresas, las instituciones, para poder desarrollar estas nuevas industrias. Tenemos que hacer lo mismo con el agua, con el hidrógeno, con data center. Que el país se compre la épica de estas nuevas tecnologías. En fin, cualquier paso que demos tiene que ser enfrentado con responsabilidad. Y la realidad es que en materia energética hemos vivido en las últimas semanas, nos confirma ese punto. Para que la transición energética realmente nos beneficie a todos, cada engranaje que compone nuestra muy, pero muy compleja industria debe funcionar a la perfección. Así como los retiros de fondos de pensiones nos recordaron a todos los chilenos lo que era la tortuosa inflación, ¿cierto? Lo que ha pasado en los últimos meses en materia eléctrica nos recuerda a todos, de todos los sectores, lo delicado que es manipular, sin un profundo análisis técnico, un mercado tan complejo y al mismo tiempo tan gravitante para las personas, para las empresas y para la economía en general, como en este mercado eléctrico. El descongelamiento de tarifas, por ejemplo, ha sido de tal impacto que el tema se ha tomado no solo la prensa económica, lo tradicional, sino que la política, incluso los matinales. Todos hablan de energía. De un día para otro la energía se ha transformado en un fenómeno social y político, algo inédito, pero que refleja el alto impacto y el alto interés que tiene en la vida de las personas y de la sostenibilidad de las empresas. Sabemos que es una problemática delicada y no es momento hoy de ahondar en ella, pero al menos quiero expresar que es demasiado importante que la institucionalidad del sistema eléctrico esté alejada del intervencionismo de corto plazo y voluntarista muchas veces de la política. Debemos recordarnos una y otra vez que tomar decisiones en caliente inhibe la discusión de largo aliento, porque es fácil distraerse con las urgencias de agentes particulares que surgen dentro de la industria o fuera de la industria. No arriesguemos las bases de un sector que ha sido tan exitoso y tan bien reconocido a nivel mundial. Un sector que ha sorteado varias crisis en base a soluciones de mercado, tomando en cuenta siempre los efectos de largo plazo en las decisiones, los impactos de estas para todos sus actores. Por último, en relación al compromiso, la transición energética no es solamente tarea del sector eléctrico, ya que nuestro sector en términos generales aporta con el 30% de las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero a nivel global. Y esa cifra ya está disminuyendo. Y en Chile, miren la gráfica, miren cómo han bajado las emisiones del sector. En 2023 las emisiones del sector de energía eléctrica bajaron 20% al 22%, y el factor de emisiones ha caído 56% en 10 años. 56% en 10 años. No es poco, pero convengamos que hay que completar el 100%. Y para eso tenemos que incluir a otros sectores y a toda la sociedad. La industria, la agricultura, el transporte, todos tenemos que aportar. El sector tecnológico con la optimización del consumo energético a través de la eficiencia en el hardware, en el software, la digitalización. El sector agropecuario con implementación de prácticas agrícolas sostenibles y el uso, por supuesto, de energía renovable en sus operaciones. La construcción con promoción de edificios verdes, sostenibles, 3D printing, etc. El sector transporte con la electrificación de vehículos y desarrollo de infraestructura de carga. La gestión de residuos con el fomento de reciclaje, la reutilización de materiales, conversión de residuos en energía, etc. Todos tienen un papel fundamental en este proceso para colaborar y empujar las condiciones habilitantes que nos permiten la transición exitosa. Y estamos en un momento decisivo para seguir transformando nuestro sistema. Debemos aprovechar las alternativas que nos brinda la tecnología, los recursos naturales que tenemos, pero por sobre todo el talento y conocimiento de nuestra gente, que ha sido pionera en muchas materias. Aún siento que toda nuestra sociedad no está consciente ni entiende la tremenda oportunidad que Chile tiene liderando la transición energética a nivel mundial. Creo que es un deber de todos los que estamos acá profundizar la relación con nuestras comunidades, educar, educar y educar en temas de sostenibilidad y que realmente esta épica sea compartida por todas y todas a lo largo y ancho de Chile. Mi sensación es que a veces nos quedamos en Santiago, nos quedamos en las grandes ciudades, pero vayan a conversar en el territorio y vean si las comunidades con que ustedes se tienen que relacionar, si el alcalde de alguna comuna alejada de un gran centro urbano se compra esta épica y entiende que para su comuna y para su comunidad estas son buenas noticias, porque tienen que serlo. Y claramente se puede, lo hemos demostrado con un enfoque equilibrado y una colaboración intersectorial, avanzando hacia un futuro donde la sostenibilidad y la prosperidad vayan de la mano. Para los que les gusta el cine japonés, un futuro más parecido a la visión de Miyazaki y no tanto como la de Mad Max. Un futuro donde lograremos adaptarnos a una tierra aún próspera y fértil, donde lograremos contener los efectos del calentamiento global efectos que hoy en día sin duda estamos viviendo, pero que no nos doblegarán. Esperamos que esta octava versión de nuestro Voces con Energía abra un espacio de diálogo sensato y reflexiones valiosas, y que signifique para todos los que estamos en esta industria y en otras industrias un punto de inflexión hacia el siguiente nivel en nuestro camino hacia la transición energética 2.0. Tengamos una buena mañana, una linda charla con Michael. Muchas gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias, José Ignacio, por tus palabras. Ahora quisiera presentar a nuestro invitado principal, Michael Liebreich. Es socio gerente de Ecopragma Capital y CEO de Liebreich Associates. Es miembro honorario del Instituto de Energía y profesor visitante en el Imperial College de Londres. Sus roles anteriores incluyen, entre otras cosas, miembro del Grupo de Trabajo sobre Eficiencia Energética del Reino Unido, asesor del Consejo de Comercio del Reino Unido, asesor de la ONU en Energía Sostenible para Todos y fundador de Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Durante la pandemia, Michael comenzó un podcast y canal de YouTube llamado Cleaning Up, donde sostiene conversaciones en profundidad con líderes y expertos en cambio climático. Quienes quieran plantear preguntas al expositor pueden formularlas a través del QR que ya está en pantalla. Pueden aprovechar de escanearlo y ir mandando las preguntas durante la exposición. Recibamos ahora con un fuerte aplauso a Michael. Welcome, Michael, to the stage.
Yes, it was great to have wind and solar and electric cars. They were cute and coming along well. But what were we going to do with shipping and industry and chemicals and agriculture and heat? So much heat demand in the world economy and energy access. All about acceleration. We can do this, but we have to understand the task. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's an enormous honor and a pleasure to be here speaking to you at this event. Just a little bit of additional context. I've traveled all over Latin America for work, for sports, tourism. I've never been to Chile before. And I find that absolutely incredible, so I apologize, because Chile is really, in many ways now, a postcard from the future in the areas on which I work all day, every day. You're a postcard from the future because you have gone so far and so fast. So what I thought I could do is three things. I want to talk about some of the global trends. I've done this for about 20 years. I've traveled to a lot of countries. I've talked about these issues. So maybe I can give a little bit of a global perspective, maybe just to help you understand that you're not alone. You may be a postcard from the future, but there are others on your shoulders and they've got your back. The second thing is, I've been here for just over 24 hours, and it's very clear, hydrogen is a big deal. So I'm going to talk about hydrogen, and some of you will really like what I say, and some of you won't. And then I'll give a few thoughts based on my 24 hours and a bit on what may be the challenges, what may be a way forwards, maybe how to think about and resolve some of the things José Ignacio has just spoken about, some of the challenges. So let's start by looking at a little history. Where are we? Not just in clean energy, but in energy overall. And we're 4 years into a decade, 2020s. It's the most turbulent decade in energy possibly ever. Even if you go back to the 1970s and you look at the oil crisis, you don't see turbulence like it. That was an oil crisis. We've had an oil crisis, a gas crisis, an inflation crisis, incredible turbulence. But I think it's fair to say that what we are in is the great clean energy acceleration. You know, in most recessions, most periods of stress and turbulence since the middle of the last century, since the Second World War, in every case, every country worried about where it would get fuel, fossil fuel. And the crises that I commentated on or analyzed in my 20 years, every time there was a crisis, clean energy was on the back burner. Clean energy slowed down. Not this time. This time, when we saw, even with the inflation, which started at the end of COVID, and then, of course, when we saw Russia invading Ukraine, this unprovoked invasion, initially, people reached for LNG to replace the Russian gas. But actually, below all of that, there was an enormous amount of focus that switched to clean energy. What does it look like? This is investment. So I started Bloomberg New Energy Finance 20 years ago, tracking all the money. Investment is destiny. If we invest in clean energy, we'll get clean energy. That was my theory. So I started to track it, and you can see here it grew very fast from the founding of New Energy Finance. And then we had about a decade when the investment was flat. Now, the amount of installations continued to grow. We've seen the numbers for Chile, but it was around the world. Megawatts grew, but the money didn't. How can that be? Because it got cheaper. It got cheaper and cheaper. And so for the same money, you could install more and more and more. And we did that for a decade. But now you see, from the year 2020, the money started to take off as well. And that is what I call the great clean energy acceleration. Just to put it in perspective, when I started New Energy Finance, 2004, 1 gigawatt of solar was an unthinkably large amount. Unthinkably large. It took a whole year to install 1 gigawatt. 6 years later, it took 1 month to install a gigawatt. 6 years later, it took 1 week. And 7 years later, 1 day. Does anybody notice a pattern? The great clean energy acceleration. What has it done to the energy system? What does the mix of electricity look like? Well, when I started New Energy Finance, this is long before it was bought by Bloomberg, this was all called alternative energy. It was something for enthusiasts, environmentalists, a few German lawmakers, but it was alternative. The green line is largely wind and solar. Blue is hydro, and you can see coal was king. 10 years later, it hadn't changed much. You see that green line? It started to kind of come up. We knew, working in the sector, that something was afoot. But other people were saying, it's 5% of electricity, but electricity is only 20% of energy, so it's irrelevant. Ignore it. It's stupid. There were plenty of loud voices saying that clean energy, renewables, was a distraction. Well, that distraction got pretty big. Globally now, around the world, 15% of all electricity is coming from wind and solar. 15%, 1-5. And that is really disruptive. Why? Zero marginal cost, and it appears when it wants to appear, and not necessarily when the market wants it to appear. And so all of the electricity markets that were based on marginal cost, they got disrupted. We're moving from a world where you price electricity based on the last kilowatt hour that you need, and effectively the variable cost of that sets the price for everybody, and it worked. We're now moving to a world where everything is capital investment. There's no fuel. And boy, this is hard to get your head around. And we have some experts in the audience who know how to do it, and we should listen to them. But it is disruptive. And that's where we are. In Chile, Postcard from the Future is absolutely in the thick of it. Now, it's going to get, I don't know whether I should say worse or better. That trend, that green line is going to continue. This was COP28 in Dubai. My friend Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, president of the COP, also president of the oil company, presided over a decision that renewables would triple by 2030. There were a few other decisions as well about moving away from fossil and so on. Is this ambitious? Tripling in 6 years feels ambitious. Unless you remember the context of the great clean energy acceleration. Another great friend, Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency. Under existing policies, the IEA expects renewables to grow by 2.5 times. So the great ambition of 3 times and 2.5 times is essentially already in the bag. So this is coming. That green curve is going to continue to grow. There's no question. Put it in context, the solar industry today has enough capacity to add 1 terawatt per year of capacity, 1 terawatt globally. In a few years, 2 or 3 years, it'll have the capacity to add 2 terawatts. Is that a lot? If you add 1 terawatt of solar, connect it to sources of demand, that would be enough to replace 5% of the world's electricity. So that green line, which took 20 years to get to 15, could take 1 year to get to 20. That's the scale of the industry. I'm not saying that's what it will do, but that's what it could do. And if it gets to 2 terawatts of capacity, you could be adding 10% per year. If anybody thinks that the future looks anything like the past, forget it. Now, that disruption to the prices Here we see Europe on the left, the US on the right. This is taking a particular dates and so on, but just to make the point that electricity prices go to zero and they go negative. And that is not a bug. That is a feature. When you have a lot of renewables and they appear when they want to, and solar appears when it's sunny, you're going to get this. So you're not alone. In the UK, on this chart, you can see the lines cumulative through the year, hours with zero price. And in the UK, we have 250 hours per year out of about 8,700 hours in a year, in case you don't know the maths. 250 hours with zero price. But we're about to build a lot more wind. Our problem is wind. Our beautiful bounty is wind. If you want a cup half full, cup half empty. We have a bounty of wind, particularly in the north. And we're about to go to 1,000 hours of zero price. And let me tell you, people who understand this are freaking out. When I say you're the postcard from the future, in your markets, we only have one market in the UK, but in your markets, you have 3,000 hours of zero spot prices. This is data behind my claim that you are the postcard from the future. Now, of course, we heard a few years ago, gas, it's the era of gas. And of course, if you have gas, you can keep the lights out when it's not windy, not sunny. But creeping up on gas, in fact, not creeping up, crushing it, is batteries. Because just as solar got really cheap, batteries are getting really cheap. So if your problem is keeping the lights on in the evening, just use a battery. You don't need a gas peaker. If your problem is there's no wind for 2 weeks, it won't be batteries. We'll talk about that. Now, around the world, as we see these problems, we have some secret allies. And even based on 24 hours here, I can see the opportunity for you also in Chile to work with these allies. José Ignacio already talked about electrification of transport. It's not just that it makes sense on its own, it helps to stabilize the grid. 3,000 hours of free electricity. Why isn't everybody driving an electric car? You're literally throwing away electricity and going to the gas station to pay money to put petrol in your SUV or whatever. Heat pumps. Again, not only do they make sense, zero carbon, etc., but they help the system because you can do thermal storage. You can put them on when you know that it's going to be a cold night. You put them on early and so on. Software will do all of that for you. And then the third one, industrial heat pumps. Industrial electrification even at higher temperatures, but especially heat pumps. That thing over on the right can produce 200 degrees centigrade heat and steam. Is this useful in some of the industries? I know we have a lot of industrial players in the audience. Anything under 200 degrees, heat pump, using maybe 3,000 hours of free electricity. Just in terms of electric vehicles, you know, we've heard in some of the international press, oh, it's slowing down, the demand isn't there. Nonsense. What's happening is legacy car companies can't sell the electric vehicles they have in their model lineup because they're not very good. Tell the Chinese that there's a slowdown in electric vehicle uptake. It's not happening. First quarter of this year, EV uptake grew by 30%. Heat pumps, here you see the EU, you see another curving line, uptake growing. US, more heat pumps sold than gas furnaces. It's happening. This is an area where I think other countries are ahead of Chile. And there you can see 200 degrees steam and heat. Many models, many companies. And then the wild card, and José Ignacio talked about it, data centers or machine learning. Cup half full, it will enormously help to manage the grid. Right? If you can't possibly hope as a human to balance all of these resources that you're going to have. But with machine learning, we can optimize asset use. And that's a secret ally as well. Cup half empty, these things are unbelievably data hungry. Data centers used to be 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts. You could put them in London and Paris and Dublin or wherever. Machine learning, generative AI needs gigawatt scale data centers. Gigawatt scale. And the countries that can build them will have gigawatt scale economic advantage. Now, I promised to talk about hydrogen. So, 150 years of the hydrogen dream. This is Jules Verne. One day, hydrogen and oxygen will be used, etc., etc. 150 years. And we see this dream of the hydrogen economy. What is a hydrogen economy? It's not just using a bit more hydrogen. We call it an economy because hydrogen will be pervasive. It'll be used multiple ways, and they will have synergy with each other, and we're going to have a brand new dawn. It's going to be marvelous. This is Chancellor Scholz. He's very explicit. He says, industry, heating, and fuels, the gas of the future. A huge boom. Unfortunate choice of words. And this one, this is Jennifer Granholm, the US Secretary of Energy, and she says it's the Swiss Army knife. Hydrogen can do everything. And she's right. Hydrogen can do everything. Feedstock, right now, fertilizers, petrochemicals, methanol, and so on. But you can also use it for storage, for transport, for heating, flying around in hydrogen aeroplanes. Everybody's excited. It's a really good analogy. I'm quite proud of it, even though I actually borrowed it from a friend of mine, Paul Martin. The reason it's a great analogy is everybody in this room has a Swiss Army knife, right? You've all got Swiss Army knives. Have you ever used the Swiss Army knife to butter your toast? Why not? You have the little knife. Have you ever cut your hair with the little scissors? The reason we don't do everything we could with a Swiss Army knife is there's almost always something cheaper, safer, more convenient. Cheaper, safer, more convenient. And hydrogen is expensive. It's hard to handle safely, and it's not convenient. Nevertheless, we have all these countries with hydrogen strategies. Everybody's gone hydrogen crazy. But that is the proportion of hydrogen, a key figure. There's 100 million tons every year of hydrogen used in fertilizers and petrochemicals, and 0.1% is made from electrolysis. Fact. Why? If we're supposed to believe this is the nirvana, the future. Why is it so hard? There are thousands of projects. I know there are tens of gigawatts of projects for green hydrogen just here in Chile. 40 gigawatts, something like that. Around the world, there are thousands of projects, but they're not going ahead. By number, 14% of green hydrogen projects have gone ahead. By volume of hydrogen, 1%. The ones that go ahead are buses, trains, forklift trucks, maybe using a hydrogen little truck in an airport, tiny projects. Why? Those ones are easy to finance. They're so small the politicians can finance them. The big ones are not going ahead. All of those hydrogen strategies were predicated on cheap hydrogen, cheap green hydrogen. $1, €1. In Japan, $2. All of them said it was going to be $1. We've got some real data now. This was a study in Holland, TNO. But there's also data from the UK auction results and various other people. Turns out it's expensive. And you need a long offtake. That's what those lines are. Those are the offtakes. You need 10, 15 years of purchase in order to finance your projects. Chile, this is 2020. I have to make a confession. I was at McKinsey. Not at 2020. I left in 1995. But this is by McKinsey. And for Chile too, there was going to be cheap hydrogen. In fact, if you look on the right, the cheapest hydrogen. And it's true. Chile could produce the cheapest green hydrogen in the world. That's not in doubt. But you're going to get down to $1 a kilo, which would be competitive with grey hydrogen. 2020, that is the dream that you were all sold. And you are going to export that hydrogen to Europe. This is a fabulous piece of work done by the Austrian Institute of Technology. On the left, optimistic, on the right, pessimistic. We're trending pessimistic, by the way. And what does it say? Well, that's what you need to achieve to be competitive in Europe, even though Europe has a carbon price, and that is going to be the cost of imports into Europe from Chile. You need €2, and your hydrogen is going to cost €3 to €5. This is a problem. The great Chilean extractive industries did not become great by selling things above the market price. Trust me. Now, we can do some numbers here. I wanted to do the numbers with the figure 1.3 million. Some of you in the audience might know why, but I'll do it with 1 million instead. It's not to embarrass any individual companies. 1 million tons of hydrogen is 1 billion kilos. This is just arithmetic, not energy policy, not engineering, it's just arithmetic. So each dollar of problem that you have on the cost front is $1 billion of missing money. If somebody can make something, or they can buy something and a grey hydrogen and a carbon credit for €1, and you try and sell it to them for €2, that's €1 billion. If it's dollars, dollars. $1 billion a year for 1 million tons of hydrogen. But the problem is, if you want somebody to build a project, you can't offer them 1 year of support. You've got to tell them that they can, you've got to sign a contract bankable with them for 15 years. That's $15 billion. Somebody has to put that on the table today. And if your problem is $3 per kilo, that's $45 billion. Just arithmetic. And somebody has to pay that. Maybe Unilever or Procter & Gamble will pay a bit more for green fertilizer. 45 billion? So is it going to come from subsidies in the buying country? Or is it going to be, you look like a fine set of Chilean taxpayers? But you can't get past the arithmetic. By the way, there's in the world about $300 billion of subsidies that have been allocated. And that's enough. Just do the maths. If it's a $3 gap, that should give you about 7 million tons of green hydrogen. 7 million. McKinsey says there's going to be 660 million in 2050. The Hydrogen Energy Ministerial says there's going to be 90 million tons by 2030. These figures are delusional. So Chile can be the cheapest, and there will be 7 million tons. If you can be the ones that get those support mechanisms, great. But if you don't get the support mechanisms, those projects, I guarantee you, will not go ahead. But I'm being very pessimistic. There's the experience curve. Why am I so pessimistic? And a lot of people tell me I don't understand experience. I made my career, I built Bloomberg NEF before that, by mapping experience curves. Here's the problem. When you make green hydrogen, that's the breakdown of costs. Over on the right, that's an expansion of the unit capital costs. And your problem is, the bit that gets cheap quickly only drives 11% of the cost. And you've got 40% electricity and another 40%, which is engineering and stuff like it. So you could take free electrolyzers, would reduce costs by 11%, and 3,000 hours of free electricity, and it would only reduce by another 15%. You need a 10x drop in costs, and I don't know where it's going to come from. And I say that as somebody who has lived by experience curves. That's the problem. Not only is it expensive to produce, it turns out it's expensive to transport. There'll be no liquid hydrogen ships. It's expensive to store, it's expensive to distribute, and it's expensive to use because of the physics of hydrogen. So that's why battery electric cars have taken off and drawn to scale. Hydrogen vehicles have not. In fact, hydrogen vehicles, the market has halved in the last 2 years, to the point globally that Ferrari sells as many vehicles as all the hydrogen cars on the market. If you're waiting, you don't want to buy an EV because you're waiting for the fuel cell car, remember the chart. But it's not just cars, it's buses, it's trains, it's heavy goods vehicles. This is Patrick Pouyanné. He actually is building hydrogen fueling stations for trucks, but he says, under oath to the French Senate, he admitted that he thinks electricity is going to win. Ammonia, I apologize. Engineers in the audience will love it, everybody else not so much. Here's the killer point though. If you try to run your economy, as Japan is trying to run its economy in future, on green ammonia back to electricity, that pathway is 20% efficient. What does that mean? It means that the electricity in Japan will be 5 times the electricity cost here if capital is free and there's no maintenance required. It's not going to happen. Can they buy a little bit with some of their subsidies? Yes. Should you supply it? Yes. But don't think you're going to see huge volumes. I did aviation because there's a lot of talk about hydrogen aircraft. So I did aviation for Chile. Jet fuel use, translate it through to how much hydrogen, how much electricity. 3.3 gigawatts, 24/7 clean electricity. Increasing the size of Chile's demand, doubling it. And by the way, it has to happen at airports. Kimal-Ogire, the new HVDC line that we hope will be ready by 2030. Just extend it straight to Santiago Airport, and you have a chance of using hydrogen aviation. Not going to happen. Now, I want to talk about storage because that brings us to how we solve some of the challenges here, potentially. Using hydrogen, you can store 3,000 hours of free electricity. What do you do during the night? Well, you can use batteries. What do you do if it's 2 days, 3 days to pair up with wind, maybe a week of low wind? There's a whole load of different ways you could use hydrogen. What you need to do is think of the whole system, not just the hydrogen, because you've got to make something, move it around, store it, and then distribute either it or the electricity from it to the user. But there are some very promising technologies here, and here's the point. If you only use this stuff 2 weeks per year, 4% of the time, it doesn't matter so much if it's expensive. If you try and run Japan on hydrogen, then Japan becomes completely uncompetitive economically. But if they only ran 2 weeks a year on stored ammonia from Chile maybe, that has a chance of working. And stored methanol, hydrogen, e-methane, maybe that is also a solution here domestically to keep the lights on when it isn't windy and isn't sunny. And the batteries, the 4-hour batteries, maybe the 8-hour batteries, they're empty. At least you can keep the economy moving. So I pulled all this together in the ladder. José Ignacio was very kind, he mentioned it. There's a few things at the top that we will do, we have to do with clean hydrogen. There's some other things that we most likely will do. Storage, you can see, is one of them. There's some things that are, I call it the row of doom, and some things we almost certainly won't do. That, I think, is the realistic view of hydrogen, and optimistic because of rows A and B. Now, I promised to finish with a few thoughts on Chile and how you might resolve some of the current challenges. First of all, well done. You are one of the leading countries in decarbonization. We saw the charts already. And you know, it's also important to celebrate, right? You have done well. You have achieved a lot. So although you face a lot of challenges with the next step, this is actually already a winning team. Internationally competitive winning team. But you face 3 great challenges. The mismatches. Chile, you can have the lowest cost wind, the lowest cost solar, and so on, but if you can't get it to the place it's needed when it's needed, that's a problem. Location, time of day, season. You know this far better than me. The locational mismatch, the time of day mismatch, and look what happens if you continue to grow, you install more solar, and the seasonal challenge. And the electricity system is really unforgiving. You have to match not just hour by hour, but down to the millisecond you have to control supply and demand. And at the other end, on the left, all the way up to seasons. This is why this is a hard challenge. It's not enough to get one of these right. Short duration, medium duration, and seasonal and longer. And the current plan, and I'm not the biggest expert, but I've summarized it, is basically overcapacity. Build, build, build. We saw how much capacity has grown relative to the average use. Pumped storage, new project, that's helpful. Batteries, smart charging. As you do electric vehicles, you will find that it makes sense to use the unused 3,000 hours and demand response. But what you need, that will not be enough. That will not be enough, or it will not be efficient. You can do it that way, but you will have to do enormous amounts of investments. It will be cheaper if you can do some biomass, perhaps, peaking plants, or just peaking plants and leave them fossil fuel for another 10 years, if necessary. Then switch them to maybe methanol or maybe ammonia or something like that. Storage, smart heat, it's a lot cheaper to store heat than electrons. And you will need to do something when you shut down all your coal and you only have gas peakers. You will need to do something at the very, very short end of things, which engineers know and most other people don't. And they're called something like synchronous condensers. Big spinning things that sit there. Most people don't even know they exist. And there's some other things which you could end up doing, possibly. Maybe they'll play a role. These are options. Maybe. We have a lot of options here. But that's not all. You can't just be good at these things individually. Chile is the best in the world for cheap solar, one of the very best for cheap wind. Individually, none of these solutions work. It has to be a system. Digitization. You can't manage the complexity of where we're going without digitizing everything. And we talked about how machine learning can help to optimize all these assets. Transmission and interconnections. Transmission, Kemal is going to help a lot. It's big, and it will help a lot. My suspicion is, by the time you build it, you'll realize you need another one. Because your power demand is going to be going up because of heating, electric vehicles, data centers, etc. And you have to fix your power markets. You have to have the price signals that make the investments efficient so that investors don't have happen to them what happened in the last few years, where they had to walk away from investments because they were no longer able to earn their returns. That is a power market problem. It's not an engineering problem. So you need, and I know I've had enough conversations in my 24 plus hours to know all of these are under discussion. All of them are already, maybe more than under discussion, actively being planned for. And so my final words are good luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Queremos pedirte que por favor permanezcas en el escenario. Invitamos ahora adelante a la periodista Angélica Bulnes para dar paso a una conversación que nos permitirá profundizar en las temáticas que hoy nos congregan. Agradecemos a todos los que enviaron preguntas y aprovechamos de recordarles que el evento será carbono neutral para que contesten la encuesta.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Muchas gracias a Colbún por la invitación. La verdad es que no solo por esta invitación, sino que he aprendido mucho con Colbún. Por de pronto, como decía José Ignacio, fui a conocer el parque eólico, la construcción y aprendí como lo que cuesta levantar este tipo de proyectos. Así que muy interesante. And thank you, Michael, because it was a very interesting presentation. As I already told you, you are a fabulous communicator and also a controversial one. I can almost hear people crying every time you say, it's not going to happen. But we will, I already have like 20 questions for you. We will go there. Guess what? Mostly many of them are green hydrogen. We will go there, but before that, I would like to start on a more personal note. With your own story, because I think your story illustrates very much what had happened with renewable energies in the last decades. So let's go 20 years ago, when you were in your early 40s, at home, unemployed after the dot-com bubble burst, and you decided to start a website, New Energy Finance, now Bloomberg New Energy Finance, to gather data and information about and then an emerging market like alternative energies. And 2 decades later, you are sitting here. You are one of the main advisors in the field. People gather to hear your opinions, your advice. So I would like to know what happened in between with you, your career, and renewable energies.
Thank you. It's a very gratifying question. You're very kind. It would be very tempting to say, I'm just executing my plan. Steve Jobs gave a very nice speech, which is on YouTube. Steve Jobs, obviously founder of Apple. It was a graduation speech where he said that you can't join the dots looking forwards. You can only join the dots looking back. So, you know, when I started New Energy Finance, I was just, in a sense, joining the dots. I had studied energy engineering. I'd been quite good at it, and I did thermodynamics. I had run an international media organization where we brought content into London. This was Associated Press Television. We brought information, content, into video into London, edited it, and sold it around the world. I had done a lot of skiing, a stupid amount.
You know that he's an Olympic skier?
So I had done really a lot of skiing and some climbing, including a lot in Latin America. And so I could see that climate change was real. I could see the impact on these fragile environments. So a lot of people were still, my peers, saying, you know, I don't think it's real. I knew it was. So these dots kind of came together when I created New Energy Finance. And, you know, but at the time, I'm going to be honest, no way could I have forecast that green line that went from 1% to 15%. That's not strictly true. I actually thought it would go to 15% by the end of my career. So either I was too conservative, or my career or my career is about to be over for whatever reason. But you know, it's been incredible. The professionalization, the sorts of executives that are now leading are completely different. The flows of money completely different. I mean, trillions. When I started New Energy Finance, the first year, there was something like, I think it was 36 billion globally invested in the transition. If you add together not just renewables, but you add electric vehicles and you add the transmission grid and you add everything we're doing, it's now about 2 trillion. So I could not have forecast that, but that's what's happened. Just the alternative energy has become absolutely, completely central to how we deal with one of the great challenges of our time, which is climate change. And the economics have transformed from where it used to cost 50 US cents per kilowatt hour for solar to where now the world record is just over 1 cent. So it's been a completely extraordinary journey. And by the way, I also met my wife and I became, I managed to sell the company and I now live comfortably. I mean, it's been a transformational, personally, since you asked, absolutely a transformational journey, extraordinary.
Okay, thank you. One of your main topics recently has been green hydrogen. So, and I told you, I have received many questions about that, but I think that the main question, or I can summarize it, it's that Chile is making a mistake, like putting so many expectations in this resource, and even having a plan on or national strategy on green hydrogen. What do you think about that?
I don't think it's a mistake if you put billions behind it and then they are lost, wasted. But to be honest, having a plan, doing some research, flying around and to a few conferences, it's not a huge mistake yet. I personally just think these projects won't happen, and most of them, not all, but most of them. And the reason it won't is because you can't sell for $3 something that somebody can buy for $2 somewhere else. And in most of the use cases, it's just not economic. And so, we see the projects, but we see them not go ahead. Not every project, by the way, announces, okay, we give up, but they just kind of disappear. And what will be left was, let's call it 1 in 10 of the grand plans will happen.
I want to do some trick. La maldad, me vino la maldad. We have a former Minister of Energy around here in the public. So I would like to ask him, Juan Carlos Llobet, if he has any question to Michael. Because he is a big promoter of the national strategy.
Come to the podium. Come up.
Come to the stage.
After your presentation, I'm not sure those applauses were honest. So I was not expecting this. So the first thing I want to say is that it's a comment and then a question. So the comment is that we spent a lot of time on our hydrogen strategy because we thought that hydrogen was the best way to take advantage of our very abundant renewable energy resources to share those resources with the rest of the world. So it was in a way driven by supply. So how do we take advantage of this? That's the first thing. The second thing is that we didn't thought that we were going to be exporting hydrogen itself. We knew very early on that that's impossible to move around in ships. So we always thought, and that's what the strategy says, that we were going to be exporting ammonia, methanol, and e-fuels in a way, which are, if I didn't get your chart wrong, the uses that might make sense. It's true that McKinsey's projections of how fast the price was going to go down are not happening, right? So that's kind of in a nutshell. I know I'm sounding defensive in a way, but anyway. And the question is, do you think that given the abundance of natural resources we have to produce renewable electricity, does it make sense to keep pushing that agenda, considering the demand cases that make sense, which are shipping, aviation, fertilizers, and so on? And what would you do if you were running the Chilean Ministry of Energy? And thank you for coming. I think it was a great presentation.
Thank you, Juan Carlos.
Well, thank you very much for offering me the ministerial brief. So, I think, first of all, in terms of the extraordinary resources, to the point that we have them, what should we do with them? I think the first thing I would say is use them domestically. So if you have got this, you're very committed, correctly committed to 2050 net zero, and you do have to solve a number of problems, and you do have to do it efficiently and cost effectively, because doing them, if we start imposing lots of costs on the population, they will, I don't want to say rebel, given what's happening in the UK at the moment, but they will push back. And I think that there is a role for hydrogen in, going in using a lot more solar and a lot more wind, which is very cheap, but then keeping the lights on. So I think I would look domestically first. I would also look domestically at fertilizer, because right now you make fertilizer, and I'm sure it has a carbon footprint. Globally, fertilizer is responsible for about 2% of emissions, and we have to clean that up. And by the way, it might mean we have to spend more. So although hydrogen, you may be selling a $3 commodity into a $2 market, maybe that's just what we have to do. But we will do it as little as possible. At the top of the ladder, as you said, maybe methanol, maybe ammonia for fertilizer. And around the world, I think what is going to happen is there will be a reset. In fact, the European Court of Auditors put out a report 2 weeks ago and said Europe needs a reset. The European aspirations are irrational. They're not based on any robust analysis, and there must be a reset. I think it's inevitable that there'll be a reset because there are literally trillions of dollars of missing money. You multiply my figures out by the aspirations, you get trillions of dollars, and nobody is about to spend trillions of dollars on this. But they will spend hundreds of billions, and they will spend it at the top of the ladder because they will not hit the net zero that is in some cases in law without doing so. And Chile can be a partner for that. So I think it's a much reduced strategy, and it's a much more focused strategy. But it's not to say, no way do I say abandon everything. I didn't talk about e-fuels, but you did, so I'm gonna go there. The problem with the pure e-fuel, carbon from the air combined with hydrogen, is that it is going to cost something. Right now, I think it's like 100 times more expensive than petrol. You have a small plant, 130,000 liters per year. It's 100 times too expensive. So it comes down. But it will never be competitive with petrol by a factor of 5. Electric vehicles, total cost of ownership, are already competitive. So the idea that they have in Germany and other places, that the cost will come down and the average person can keep their car because they'll put an e-fuel in it, maybe made in Chile, is completely ridiculous. Completely not going to happen. For aviation, but again, you won't use carbon from the air because that's too expensive. So in aviation, we will do some biofuel. By the way, almost all biofuels and biogas that we do today is wasted because the biofuels go into transportation, should be electric, and the biogas goes into the grid, which does heating and power generation, which should be electric and renewables. All of those biofuels, therefore, are available for aviation, but then the volume runs out, and you could do a synthetic fuel, but you will use a biogenic carbon with green hydrogen. And your problem in Chile is, where's the biogenic carbon going to come from? How do you compete with Brazil or Colombia or Venezuela if it sorts out its politics, which I hope it does? So there are other countries more competitive for aviation fuels. And this is cold, hard reality. And I think so a strategy that's much more reduced, much more focused, and takes into account these issues would really, I think, help the country move on the focused ones more quickly and to leave aside the others.
Thank you, Michael. I have another question, another one more personal, but it's from the public. I think that it's also from a green hydrogen lover, because what is the thing you used to truly believe was true regarding renewables, but you no longer think it is?
How have I? Well, I mean, so one of the things is the hydrogen ladder is iterative. So we're now on version 5.
Okay, you're always moving.
Moving things around as I learn. And, when I put out version 1, a lot of people said, this is wrong and that is wrong. I believed those things. and I can admit that I was wrong, and you can prove I was wrong because version 2 was different. So, of course we don't know everything, and we're always learning, but, thermodynamics and the microeconomics are a hard taskmaster. When I look at the breakdown of green hydrogen costs, that they currently cost, $8, $9, $10 per kilo, and we need to get it down to $1 or $2. And, that I won't be wrong on that. It's going to be very hard to push those costs down. We will push them down, but it won't go down like batteries, and it won't go down like solar, I guarantee you. On renewables, the funny thing is, even 15 years ago, 20 years ago almost, I said, okay, I started the business just tracking a few projects, trying to create a service, make a bit of money, rescue my career after the dot-com crash. But a few years in, I said, actually, do you know what? This is transformational. This is going to transform energy, and it's going to cost trillions of dollars, and it's going to require public policy, and it's going to require private money, but it's going to be huge. And I said that, but I didn't really believe it. I couldn't imagine it being that transformational, but I do now.
And you are now talking, this is the question for the people's question today in Chile. You have been talking about the great clean energy acceleration. We have so many different kind of renewable energies, but anyway, we are going to pay more for our electrical bills. How can you explain that?
Yeah. With the benefit of my 24 hours, I'm going to say holding the price down, it was necessary at the time, but probably went on too long. Price caps always lead to underinvestment, and they always lead to social unrest when you remove them, when you're forced to remove them. And we've seen that in all sorts of countries. So that doesn't make it any easier in the situation you're in today, because the prices have to go up and people have to be remunerated. But there's a lot of distortions in your system that also, I think, need to be addressed. So, for instance, you have distributed generators up to 9 megawatts. Well, 9 megawatts is not a distributed generator. Distributed is when you have solar on the roof here, in a conference center, in a hotel, or on your home, or in your office, or the car park, or whatever. When you get to 9 megawatts and you're subsidizing it, that's a problem, to be honest. So there's a lot of things that we can do. But I also think what's needed here is electric cars, electric heating, they should reduce people's bills, particularly if you have surplus electricity, which you have. So then the question for the policymakers is, how do you map the great strengths of Chile in terms of resources and what you've built so far, make sure it delivers for the Chilean average person? And instead it's going to just look like price increases, and then they'll check out, I guarantee you.
You're not now talking about electrifying everything with renewable energies, but you already know that we have been experiencing massive blackouts after the rainstorm last week. What I don't pretend you to be an expert in this situation, but what we are experiencing now here in Chile is something that it's also happening in other countries, and what you could tell us about what lesson should we take?
So my understanding of what happened last week was that it was I don't want to call it a freak windstorm, because with climate change, maybe it's not freak, but it was the distribution network that suffered. Trees fell on the wires and so on. So it's very easy in this group. People are very smart and they understand, okay, it was the distribution, not the supply and so on. But the bigger point is we need a resilient system. We need a resilient system. And actually, we need it more than we may think, because in the background, we've been removing piles of coal here you don't have a lot of gas in the system, but in Europe, we've been removing gas, right? And if we go to electric cars, or electric transport, we remove oil. So these are the big buffers in the system for resilience, and we're removing them when we go electric. And we have to be very intentional about how we provide resilience. That's why when I say hydrogen might be, it would be in the national plan, in my ministerial national plan, I would be putting money into hydrogen storage, or methanol storage, or ammonia, something. Because if you strip away all of the layers of storage, then you're creating a very volatile system. And a power cut, a power cut now is much worse than a power cut 10 years ago. The Google Nest doesn't work. If you have got an electric car,
much worse.
You can't drive it and so on. Think about a power cut in 10 years' time, the system that José Ignacio talked about building, and he will build, and the rest of you as well. But a power cut when the police cars are electric and the ambulances are electric and the heating for the old people is electric, etc., is really catastrophic, to the point where it may be impossible to get the system back running. So we have to really invest in that resilience. Will it deal with the wires? It would be great if you could have more people with solar on their roof and batteries and a heat pump and a car that can do vehicle to grid. And you've got resilience. So yes, the wires are down, but you can at least still charge your phone, have the heating on a few hours a day and drive around on your own power. Australia, 1 house in 3 has solar on the roof. I don't see any houses with solar on the roof here. Why? How? Is that regulation? Is it too expensive? It's not because it's too expensive. It must be to do with permitting, and the ecosystem of providers are not there. In Germany now, people are buying solar balconies. You have a balcony? They buy a solar balcony, they install it, they plug it in. Do you know how many permits they need to do that? 0. It's very disruptive, by the way, for the utilities and the network, because all they see is demand drops. They don't know why. But it's resilient, and people love it. And so you get the population along with you as well.
I'm curious about that. To achieve that goal, resilience or the net zero emissions, more or less regulation? What do you think about that?
I cannot answer your question, but I'll answer it a different way.
Okay.
Now, first of all, there is no way that this happens in a libertarian world of no regulation. With no regulation, none of this happens. By the way, with no regulation, we don't have an aviation industry, we don't have a telecoms industry, we don't have a medical industry, right? So, we have to live with regulation. The role of the state, one of its main roles, security, and creating markets to allocate resources, or to allow private operators to operate and to deliver the goods that society needs. In this case, lots of cheap energy, but without emissions. So we need smart regulation. I don't know if it's more or less, but it needs to be smart.
You know that here in Chile, probably in your different meetings, you have heard about that. We have a problem with the permitting process, the assessment process. Again, is this a Chilean problem, or you are hearing about that in many other places? And who should we be looking at for this?
So it is absolutely, permitting and the slow permitting process is absolutely not a Chilean problem. It's a problem everywhere I go. And the fundamental challenge that you've got is the really most difficult one is around transmission. Because, it takes a few years to build supply, it takes a few years to build demand, but it takes a decade or more sometimes to get the transmission built. So there's a few things you can do to speed it up. You can designate corridors, strategic corridors. You can invest ahead of demand. But it's going to be a challenge. And how can I put this? I think it's good that it's a challenge in some ways, because actually we need people to be brought along with this. This is not China. I nearly said this is not France, where you can just do eminent domain. You know, we built the Euro tunnel, the train between Paris and London, and for about 15 years, the train went through France like that, and then it got to England, and then it was like this, slow. Why? Because we were having consultations, because the rule of law and property is different in the UK, and it protects the individual more. And I don't think that's bad. It slows things down, but ultimately, I kind of like the system that is very thoughtful. So don't think it's all bad. It's very frustrating when you really see it through one lens, decarbonization, clean energy. But if you look at it for society, having proper processes of consultation and planning kind of, you know, speed them up, but don't get rid of them.
Okay, I have to be generous with the public because they have many questions. So one of them is how renewable energy power plants can be financed with most of the production at zero or negative prices?
Yeah. Well, the answer is you can't finance on a merchant, it's called a merchant basis. If that was the only market you were selling into, you know, a solar farm that is going to get zero revenue anytime it's sunny is obviously impossible. So, but there are, you know, other mechanisms, and power purchase agreements or the tariffs that are, you know, the state-mediated tariffs. But I would like to see, as I say, that zero price electricity gets to market, gets used. And we've seen big uses, data centers or electrification and so on. So if there's a market for that electricity, the price won't be zero. It shouldn't be. Although I said that zero prices are a feature, not a bug, but a zero price every time it's windy and every time it's sunny, that is a bug. That is a bug.
And I have a question from Analia, which is sitting there. Which is the fastest way to increase electric demand in the middle of a tariff bump-up crisis? I think that data centers, because of artificial intelligence and modularity of data centers. But are there other ways to stimulate electrification if there's no economic incentive for growing from current 83 terawatts demand into 120 terawatts a year towards 2030?
Well, so I would come back. Thank you for the question. But I would come back to, I think much quicker than data centers should be electric vehicles. Because, as I say, you literally have people standing in the shadow of wind or solar farms and paying money for petrol for their vehicles or paying for heating. And that feels like it should be fixable. And by the way, if you think, oh, but the cars are too expensive and so on. No, the Chinese cars, the $12,000, and they work. Will they drive you 300 miles with your family and the dog and towing a trailer? No, that's not what most people do. So I think that and I'm not saying go buy Chinese cars. It would be lovely if some of them were made elsewhere or made maybe domestically is probably too much of a dream, but maybe with some of the battery components and the supply chain that you should have here in Chile. But I think that that's one where we have really seen very rapid growth in demand in other countries. So electrification I would look for vehicles and I would look for heat. And you know, one of the problems that you've got is that for individuals have a very high cost of capital. Most people, if you say, upgrade your heating, it'll pay for itself in 20 years, they'll say, forget it. So that there are ways that you need to be creative around the financing, working with the finance sector, government, you know, plus the finance sector, to make it easy for people to upgrade and to electrify their heating. And I think that that's probably where and data centers, sure, they are modular and you can add some demand, but, you know, it's going to be, the only thing you can do quickly would be a few, you know, 100 megawatts or something. You're not going to build a gigawatt scale data center. You're not going to build that in 5 years. But you could have a policy environment for electric vehicles. You could have that within 6 months.
But what happened, because we are talking about economic incentives and also like public policy, but what happened if we do nothing? Like, because you are talking the great clean energy acceleration, it's going to happen anyway, or it's not going to happen?
No. So my experience of the last 20 years, if you do nothing, then first of all, there'll be some very creative people, probably in this room, who will figure out a way to navigate around some of this. So something will continue to happen, but it'll be slow, it'll be difficult, it'll be economically inefficient. You know, I left with the three messages: digitization, transmission, and market reform. If you don't do those, then things will grind to a halt here. But don't forget, the acceleration is a global phenomenon. So there will be, right now, there is extraordinary amount of solar panels being sold in Pakistan. And I did an episode of my podcast, Cleaning Up, with Jenny Chase.
The last one.
The last episode with Jenny Chase, the greatest solar analyst in the world, who doesn't know what they're doing with them in Pakistan. Because it's so difficult to know exactly. There's so many markets. I think Bloomberg NEF now tracks 146 markets. So the point being, somewhere else there'll be a boom. And I've seen this for 20 years. Things grind to a halt in one country, they go crazy in another. So the acceleration will continue, but it would be a great shame if it was slowing down here.
I think that we are almost on time, but I would like to know, José Ignacio, ¿tienes una última pregunta para ahí en la primera fila? ¿No? Nadie tiene una. Bueno, yo tengo one last question from the public. What is your view? Adelante.
About the role of natural gas in energy transition. Because we have committed public policy to be carbon neutral by 2050.
So if I repeat, because part of the question may have been lost. The question
What's the role of natural gas?
Yeah, the role of natural gas. So I think if you wanted to move very fast on another large amount of wind and solar installations, you can do storage, and you are doing storage. So it's very important to unlock batteries and pumped hydro. The pumped hydro is going to take some time. The batteries, really the costs are coming down absolutely extraordinarily. But I think gas could also free up the space to shut coal. You have coal plants that are running because they need to run 24/7. So they're pushing solar and wind, off the grid, which is kind of crazy. So you could very quickly replace those with gas peakers and only run them when they're needed. And it would be fossil, and you'd be investing in fossil, and some of the activists will go crazy. But before 2050, you can either have the time to add enough batteries and pumped storage, and geothermal is another one that we should probably talk about. Some very promising things happening. So it gives you the space. By 2050, it would not stop you from getting to net zero. And even if you kept those machines, which, by the way, can also act as synchronous condensers, so they can also be useful to provide the power quality, because you can have a gas peaker where part of it still spins and provides the inertia. You could do that within a year or two, and then ultimately either shut them down again, keep just the synchronous condenser piece, or store hydrogen, methanol, ammonia, or whatever, and use them 1 week a year, 2 weeks a year, and that would give you a really nice pathway to net zero. Does that mean you should do only that? No, as I said, storage, pumped hydro, sort out the policy signals, electric vehicles, electric heating, and so on. But gas, as part of what you should do in the next few years, for me, it's a yes.
Considering that you are a British person, I want to appreciate myself of being very punctual. 11 o'clock, we are done. Thank you very much, Michael. It was a fantastic conversation. Big applause for you. Thank you for coming. And gracias a todos por esta mañana, por la atención y por los dueños de casa. Muy excelente entrevistado y muy buena conferencia. Muchas gracias y buenos días.